A very good evening to you, friends of the Duke Graduate School. On behalf of Dr. Paula D. McLean, the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Professor of Public Policy, and Dean of the Graduate School and Vice Provost for Graduate Education, who created and launched our Race and Bias Conversation series. From all of my colleagues across Duke, I consider it a privilege and an honor to have you join us for our second conversation of the year and our fourth conversation in the series. To find out more about past and future conversations, visit us at gradschool.duke.edu and type race and bias in the search engine and select race and bias conversations. I call your attention to the earlier slides that indicated that this session is being recorded and may be made publicly available on the Graduate School's website. Questions for our presenters this evening can be placed in the chat box. I am excited, and I'm going to move out of the way, about this evening's conversation discussing structural inequality and systemic racism closer to home, which is led by one of our graduate student groups, Women in Science and Engineering, or WISE. This group and their invited guests, wait till you hear, will guide our conversation this evening. So with that, I am so pleased to introduce Felicia Lim, sixth-year PhD student in molecular cancer biology. I also want to mention our cohort of graduate students that I'm so grateful for: Blair Willett, Jovita Bimira, Yuran Chan, and Ariel Powell. Felicia, thank you so much for your leadership. I relinquish the floor, Madam Chair.
Oh dear. First of all, I am not a sixth year. I am a fifth year still, not yet a sixth year. Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Felicia. I am a fifth year PhD student here at Duke. As mentioned by Dean Allen, I'm here to represent Women in Science and Engineering, which is a Duke graduate student organization focusing on being the advocacy group for women identifying graduate students and postdoc fellows here in the STEM fields and allies here at Duke. So as also mentioned by Dean Allen, there are other student leaders here with us, and I will let them introduce themselves. So perhaps Blair, we'll start with that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Blair Willett, and I'm a third-year PhD candidate in the Department of Pharmacology and Cancer Biology. And I've been a part of WISE for the past 3 years and serving on their planning committee. And now I'll pass it on to Jovita.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jovita Bimera. I am a fourth-year PhD student in pharmacology, and I'm also the president of Duke African Graduate and Professional Student Association, or the DAGIPSA. Happy to be here.
I guess I can go next. My name is Yuran Chan. I am a fifth-year PhD student in the Department of Neurobiology here at Duke, and I am currently the vice president of Duke First, which is the first generation graduate student group here on campus.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ariel Powell. I am a second-year MBA student at the Fuqua School of Business and president of Duke's Black Graduate and Professional Student Association. Really excited to speak with you all tonight.
Thank you so much for everyone who is actually helping out for this. So today we are really grateful to have two amazing professors to lead this particular conversation. First, we have Dr. Jay Pearson, the assistant professor in the Stanford School of Public Policy. He is also the assistant research professor of global health and the associate of the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. I'm pretty sure he has other titles, but I'm just gonna lead with that 3 because that actually shows how great he is and how important his research is as well for this particular conversation. Our second speaker for today is Abdullah Antepli, who is the Associate Professor of the Practice of Interfaith Relations of Duke Divinity School. He is also an Associate Professor of the Practice in Sanford School of Public Policy. Without further ado, I will give the time to Dr. Jay Pearson to start the conversation for today.
And so I just started the share screen. Can you all see the screen? Perfect. So I'd be lying if I didn't say I've given entire talks before without sharing the screen and nobody stopped me. So my charge today, if I understand it correctly, is to discuss with you all these 3 constructs, structural inequality, structural racism, and systemic racism. And I'll start by offering a conceptual definition of structural inequality and discuss its major components. I then discuss structural racism as an illustrative example of structural inequality and structural racism in the US context, and conclude by explaining how structural racism in turn informs and is the foundation upon which systemic racism is built. Structural inequalities are any sets of social processes and other mechanisms that are systemically advantageous to majority population groups while being simultaneously systemically disadvantageous to minority population groups. This means that minority advantage comes at the cost of minority disadvantage. There's an exchange. The majority-minority social distinction in structural inequality is not about demographic distributions or which group is more than 50% of the broader population. In structural inequality, the majority-minority social distinction implies social actions by one group, the majority, relegating select targeted other groups to inferior or subaltern positions. These social others are effectively minoritized, that is a verb, in relationship to and through social interactions with those who consider themselves superior. These dynamics are enforced through social asymmetries in power, that is, the direction of influence, which group can meaningfully leverage action against other groups on a social gradient in ways that the other groups, the minority, cannot in turn leverage action back against them. Status, which group, again, the majority, has disproportionate direct access to the desirable things in life, high quality formal education, prestigious jobs, and material possessions. And then finally, standing. Which group gets to construct, disseminate, and tell stories about the broader social order? Which group wields authoritative knowledge? Who sets the narrative? The majority-minority social distinction then is reflected by differences in the fundamental right to self-determined identity construction for some, again, the majority, and then the absence of this same fundamental right for others, the minority, who have their identities constructed and imposed upon them by the dominant group. This majority-minority identity construction distinction has implications for differences in the capacity for all population groups to justly and fairly reflect human dignity and social valuation when representing themselves as they engage the broader social context. In the US racial context, think whites making decisions about the lives of populations of color in ways that those populations of color cannot make decisions about whites, the wealthy making decisions impacting the lives of those who are not wealthy, men making decisions impacting women. For international context, in addition to wealth and gender, the majority versus minority status distinction can apply to different groups by religion, ethnicity, tribal affiliation, and national origin. The structural in this concept is defined as core fundamental guiding principles and the macro level, that is big picture, decision-making processes emerging from them. And inequality is defined as processes of differential human valuation. So what we are proposing to address here are the ways that notions of human difference influence how societies get constructed. In essence, how cognitive representations about group level differences and the justifications for them inform and become social systems. Inextricably linked to these processes are the sets of norms, that is, widespread regular beliefs, values, practices, behaviors, even cultural orientations developed and utilized to explain and justify group-level human differences across diverse identity groups. Do these norms reflect belief and awareness, belief that inherent differences reflecting a natural order are responsible, or do these norms reflect awareness that group identity population level differences are socially constructed? If they're socially constructed, who then has done that constructing? And now, our illustrative example of structural inequality is structural racism, which is a particular form of inequality. And structural racism, as we know it in contemporary US society, entails sets of social arrangements, relationships, and conditions that are systemically advantageous to majority population whites, while being simultaneously systemically disadvantageous to minority populations of color. Structural racism holds that macro level social processes associated with racial construction, racial hierarchy, as well as racial bias are central organizing features of the nation that were established before its founding, that remain salient to the US social order until the present, and that these are multifaceted, interconnected, co-occurring phenomenon, as well as dynamic and responsive ones. This means that individuals who are gatekeepers, who are attending to racial oppression, do not have to exist for it to be perpetuated, right? This also means that structural racism is inextricably linked to US national identity. It pervades and suffuses virtually every major institution comprising US society and is consequently systemic. As such, it negatively determines the life chances and lived experiences of US-based populations of color to the benefit of white Americans, far beyond individual acts of interpersonal racial discrimination, which survey research teaches us is what most people think of when they hear the language of racism. Because it's so linked to US national identity, this is who we are. It's who we've been since before the inception of the United States of America. And last summer's animated protest against dehumanizing racial injustice notwithstanding, who we will likely continue being if we don't see similarly animated policy changes in the major institutions comprising broader society. And indeed, this includes Duke University. Race, then, is a social construct conceived of, developed, imposed, and maintained, perpetuated by European immigrants to the emerging US. The race construct dehumanized the social other to justify material exploitation of Native Americans through the appropriation of their historical lands and economic exploitation of Black Africans through chattel slavery. So race is about stolen land and stolen labor. It's about stolen humanity and stolen lives, history, heritage, and culture. But perhaps most importantly, for contemporary manifestations of racism, it's also about stolen narratives. The way that this story has been constructed, who has disproportionately gotten to construct it and disseminate it, has implications for our capacity to understand how racism operates in contemporary society. The race construct suggested that differences in desirable underlying traits, here I have listed intelligence, work ethic, family values, I can make this list much longer, were inherently and systematically associated with one or some combination of phenotype, what people look like, geographic origin, where they came from, or ancestry, who their foremothers and forefathers could be documented to have been. These same Northwestern European immigrants argued that notions of these differences in these desirable traits implied a natural hierarchy of human populations with themselves disproportionately displaying the desirable traits, and consequently worthy of being at the pinnacle of this hierarchy, while all populations of color and some European populations diverse on the dimensions of national origin, ethnicity, and religion disproportionately displayed undesirable traits and subsequently naturally occupied lower positions in this same hierarchy. Belief in and values associated with notions of this natural system became normalized over time. And these normalized views and beliefs were institutionalized through policy decision-making that effectively establish and maintains a rigid stratified racial hierarchy that uses one or some combination of what people look like, where they came from, and who their ancestors were as social markers for differential placement in these stratified hierarchies and subsequent differential treatment. And so racialized differences are not the result of any population being disproportionately represented on desirable traits or undesirable traits, but is a function of using, again, these markers as identifiers for where these populations would be placed in these stratified hierarchies of differential human valuation and how they would subsequently be treated, right? And so any differences that we see in contemporary society are the results of these historical and contemporary social, economic, educational, and political circumstances reflecting how groups of people were and are differentially identified, socially ordered, and treated. This differential treatment is called racial bias. Positive racial bias manifests as supremacy, the notion that one group is inherently superior, right? And then privilege, the sets of advantages that are conferred as a function of occupying preferred status in this system of supremacy. And then negative bias, which is oppression, the process of relegating unpreferred categories to inferior positions, and discrimination, which is the active process of imposing unincurred disadvantages that restrict and constrain the perspectives and interests of populations of color. So racial bias definitely influences the distributions of resources and risk that differentially determine life chances by racial category, but it also influences the types and qualities of experiences that members of different racial groups have as they engage the institutions that relegate access to resources and exposure to risk. Think higher institutions of higher education, formal education and university settings, and racial and gendered bias in terms of how curricula get constructed, right? Historical social supremacy and oppression as well operate in contemporary society in ways that most of us have not given very careful consideration. And it is the absence of that careful consideration that stymies us as we attempt to offset this. So what we are dealing with here are sets of both historical and contemporary norms and values, policies and practices in the US that create, maintain, and perpetuate white supremacy while simultaneously oppressing populations of color. This reflects what we have come to think and believe about race and how that both influences and is reinforced through policy decision-making. Structural racism then, and this is the final definition, is defined as sets of social processes and mechanisms operating from the macro level normative down through policy decision-making that influence the development and maintenance of racially biased institutions. This is the background and context that makes possible and supports acts of interpersonal racial discrimination, which again is what most people think of when they hear the term racism. These arrangements, relationships, and conditions are systemically advantageous to majority population whites, while being simultaneously and systemically disadvantageous to minority populations of color. And these systems of assignment, stratification, and bias pervade and suffuse virtually every major institution, every major dimension of US society, and operates at multiple levels of influence within them. And so the challenge then is not to focus just on differences in outcomes by racial category and propose what we refer to as ameliorative responses, that is, trying to intervene on the proximal risk factors, teaching people to value formal education more, which is a myth, teaching people to exercise and eat healthier for racialized differences in health outcomes, the research that I do. That's not ideally what we should be doing. What we should be doing, I and others who do this work propose, is aspiring to identify and intervene on the structural drivers of these phenomena and the pervasive nature of systemic mechanisms as the fundamental root causes of racial and other forms of majority versus minority status distinction inequality. And with that, I am done with my portion of this evening's speech, and I will pass over to Dr. Abdullah Antipoli, who will explain to us how we can actually improve upon these challenges.
Thank you so very much. What a pleasure. And what was I thinking when I said I was just going to follow Dr. Jay Pearson? Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am just humbled by this incredibly condensed wisdom that my dear brother and friend, Jay Pearson, has shared. My remarks will be focusing on exactly what he charged me, how to bring all of this home, how not to keep having this conversation over crisis after crisis. I don't know, not many of you have been sharing your videos, but if I ask you, how many of you are simply sick and tired of having conversations about systemic racism, structural inequality? Why can't we just make some progress? Why do we find ourselves in such a humiliating and embarrassing repetition of certain mistakes? We find ourselves over and over, often through another crisis after crises. So this is an invitation, not that I figured it out, not that I have any magical pills. How can we have this conversation that it will taste like Blue Devil, reality? It will feel like home. How can we at least do things or talk the way we discuss about them will enable, empower, and inspire us to make a difference in areas and spaces like Duke University where we can make a difference. I have few suggestions in that regard in 6 and 7 minutes, but the real challenge is to have this conversation with all of you with these suggestions and ideas, but not limited to them. Education for the sake of education is sacred. Education, learning about anything and everything, even if it doesn't really make you do anything, it's sacred. But this structural inequality and systemic racism is not one of those education. We should approach to the conversations about structural inequality and systemic racism, not like, again, in that esoteric, sacred, abstract concept of education for the education. This learning about structural inequality and racism has to make us do things, has to make us, it should be done in a way, the presenters and the people who are receiving this education, as a result, should be different people, should be engaging in a different set of actions and behaviors. I have a beautiful story from the culture that I grew up in. There's a story many Turkish Muslim kids learn. In the beginning of the creation, the birds didn't have any wings, they didn't fly. One day, God descended from the heavens to the earth, and God played some music to the birds. God played some divine heavenly melodies to these creatures who didn't have any wings and who didn't know how to fly. And then when God went back to the heavens, that heavenly melodies and music moved the birds so much. Out of longing and missing, the birds started wanting to be closer to the heavens and God and wanting to hear that music again. The birds started growing wings and they started to fly. So this music, that divinely heavenly difficult music that Jay Pearson and many of my colleagues have been singing, it should be coming as a heavenly responsibility, that as a result we should be growing some wings and legs and walk and act and do things, not just learn as an intellectual conversation as we often do in graduate seminars. This is not one of them. It has to make us grow ethical and moral wings. It has to make us individually and collectively, individually as a community within Duke and beyond, has to make us walk in the direction that we need to be walking. Secondly, structural inequality and systemic racism, by definition, if it is systemic and structural, means it has built over time. It has done for a very long time. We keep repeating the same mistakes over and over that it became part of who we are. We are sometimes doing it habitually. We don't even see it. Therefore, any solution, any walking in the right direction requires us to interrogate our past. If somebody shows up on a doctor's office with a lot of health problems, the doctor doesn't say, okay, here's a fix here. That means that health problems have accumulated over time and probably will take some time to get there. But how to interrogate our past? How to look into the calamities of Native American genocide? How to discuss slavery? This is an educational failure, broadly speaking. But we are not as bad as many other nations. At least our relative success gives me a lot of encouragement broadly within the American society, but especially at Duke University. I grew up in a country where saying the word Armenian genocide is 2.5 years in jail. Because of my public advocacy of Armenian genocide, I have a standing court conviction to be jailed for 2.5 years, just naming the calamities of the past, the genocide or the disaster that my great-grandparents, we cannot even speak in that culture. Compared to that, what we are here, at least we have a way in which we can engage, if not the entire big picture American tragedies, but what we have done at Duke University. We have to interrogate our past through the ethical moral wings that we have grown, and without that we can't. There's a very good example in our recent past. The beautiful picture that you see behind Felicia, my friend, this Gothic land, majority of what you see and deeply moved by the aesthetic beauty was designed by an African-American architect, Julian Abel. He was never able to see what's being built because he was an African-American. It's a shameful chapter of Duke history. It took so long, we should have done it much earlier, and we should do even more by just recognizing a couple of years ago when we named the quad Julian Abel, and when we just brought ourselves public to acknowledge an embarrassing, shameful chapter of our own history. And we brought ourselves to recognize, again, if this remains as a ceremony and a plaque and just naming, again, we failed miserably. But at least I'm giving you much worse examples from where I grew up. People can't even say it. That it gives me a good encouragement that there is a way in which we can only bring this home by not only growing wings, but interrogating through those wings and prisms and lenses our past. We have to study, if we can't do the entire past of this nation, study the history of the Duke University. Why, and in so many ways, we need to honestly and candidly engage with our past in order to move to the future. Another conversation is, a lot of these structural inequality and systemic racism conversation often turns into guilt or blame game. And the result is often paralysis and despair and hopelessness. That's why there is very little action. That's why we keep repeating ourselves in the same cycle of this. Is there a way in which we can discuss this, not as a guilt prism, but through the prism of responsibility? Yes, there are few people who are guilty, as Abraham Joshua Heschel, the famous rabbi of the 20th century, said. But who's responsible to fix this? What are how we cannot really only understand this by pumping directly or indirectly guilt into the people who may or may not be guilty of what's being said or done. But I think every single one of us are responsible, every single, including international students. While you are on campus, what is your individual responsibility? What can I do in this 4, 5, or 6 years that you are at Duke University? We have to really bring it down and break it down to the individual responsibility and collective responsibility here at Duke University. Another category, which I think is a wrong way to go about discussing these issues, is many of us in this structural inequality and systemic racism, we get lost in the clownish, ridiculous show of racists. We get lost in the noise and the sensational feeling of these few far between bad people. And regretfully, we are not seeing the bigger picture. We are not seeing the real actual issues. I guarantee you, I've been at Duke University for about 12 years. There are very, very few, much less overtly racist people on this campus. There were many more in 1960s or 50s, etc. But now I know many decision makers. I know people who write the big fat checks, who are the power players. You cannot really, in the most stereotypical sense, talk about racists when you talk about these people. But I know Duke enough that there are very few racists, but is there racism? Is there a systemic racism? Absolutely, yes. Are there policies keep producing the same structural inequality? Absolutely, yes. Then why are we not discussing these particular policies? Why are we looking for pointing finger at people and looking for guilt? So we have to move from, again, intoxicating, somewhat marveling conversation about bad people doing bad things into bad policies, over time, vomiting bad and toxic structural inequality and the systemic racism. The third one, which I already used my 6 minutes, but maybe the last one, we can discuss the rest later on. One other unhelpful way of discussing these issues is the silo culture. I think this modern liberal arts education is putting us through. The silo culture of discussing these issues and their unique manifestation, the unique manifestation of structural inequality and systemic racism, creates this compartmentalized mentality of racism is about Black people, homophobia is about LGBTQ people, Islamophobia is about a bunch of Muslims, anti-Semitism is about Jews, and because it's done in such an unhelpful way, it puts the onus into the victims of this problem instead of perpetrators, instead of what policies and structural realities are perpetuating this question. In a way, I have seen this over and over. We really have to unpack, as if the racism is about African-American siblings, and if they figure out this solution, if it's about them, onus is on them. As if the Islamophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry is about Muslims, this weird religion and its weird followers. Somehow, if they figure out something, it will be gone. Anti-Semitism is Jewish problem. Let the Jewish siblings cry about this. If we cannot break these unseen walls between various manifestations of same cancer, we will not be able to solve this problem. If we cannot build an ethical moral front and as a united ethical moral individuals and citizens of Duke University combat, I am not saying I despise that statement, not all lives matter, all hates matter. These are, like every cancer is different. We have to deal with it, and we have to give priority to this much greater scale, especially what certain structural inequality and racism destroys particular communities. But we have to understand that this is a common human evil manifesting in many different colors and faces. It requires a collective action, collective front. We cannot assign this to a particular group and think that victims are primarily responsible, explain, educate, and find out medication for this problem. It cannot be such. We have to find a collective platform to deal with this question. The last, very last, I think one analogy I would like to discuss with you, we are eating, breathing, dreaming healthcare pandemic in the last 11 months. So if we understand structural inequality and systemic racism as a pandemic, can we use the analogy and the kind of experience that we have gained in the last 11, 12, 14 months? And can we deal with this issue as a healthcare problem? Because why I'm saying this, I am, as I said, and apologize for my French, I am sick and tired of keep talking about this. Because I don't think the existing strategies are working. Speaking truth to the power is not working. Protest and outrage is not working. It's not moving us from morally critiquing the problem into coming up with the right policies and solutions. So one last thing is, we cannot keep doing the same thing and expecting this different result. That's the definition of being insane. What bad practices that we need to stop doing in this regard so that we can bring the conversation home? And what are some of the new creative way potentially the healthcare crisis, pandemic lenses is providing us to really go to the root cause of this problem and bring it home? Apologize for my 4 minutes edition. I highly encourage you to listen to the recording and listen to Jay Pearson's presentation. Every word he used is so condensedly wise and to the point, and consider it's a divine music. And if it's not making you grow any action out of it, that means there's something about your receiving and decoding the, I'm speaking for myself. Let's do this. Let's at least not be in the same spot after another next George Floyd conversation or another Eric, I can't breathe episode. Like, we can't do this. We can't be seeing a banana peel on our walkway and say, shoot, we are going to fall again. We have stepped up on those banana peels and repeated the same mistakes over and over, that it's enough. At least on Duke campus, let's talk about concrete policies and issues and see where we are in the next couple of years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That is great and definitely has tons of questions for us to discuss. Thank you so much for both Dr. Jay Pearson and Dr. Abdul Antepli. Please use the reactions, I guess, to kind of like show the, doing this, I guess. Oh, okay, so we have a couple of some minutes to actually address any questions that you all might have for both speakers. Feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat. We will be looking into it and we will help you ask the questions if you have any.
Yes, Abdullah did such a good job that he eliminated all the questions before they were asked.
Far from it. Not only there is no quick answer to this question, one thing we cannot do, as I briefly said, the result of this conversation cannot be despair and hopelessness. It cannot be paralysis. It cannot be inaction. Then we fail. Nations and individuals are not judged by their mistakes. They are primarily judged by their reaction to those mistakes. Everybody does mistakes, but we will be primarily judged whether or not we are ethical, moral individuals or ethical, moral university, campus communities, is how do we react to these problems and mistakes that we make?
I think I do have a question in general, is that you did bring out a really good point about how we approach this particular problem, let's put it that way, right? In terms of like, okay, we have experienced this over and over again, and we have done so many different talks about it, and yet there's an inaction, and you did mention about how we can change that. But I think to be able to change it, we have to know what is wrong with the way we do it right now. Because if not, we're just gonna do like trial and error. It's like how I do it in the lab is that if I do a protocol and I did not get the results, and if I have no idea what went wrong with it, I'll just have to keep changing it, and it will take so much time. So I think my questions for both of you is that the way we have been doing it, like all of these talks and all of this education that we have been trying to put forward, at least on this particular campus, which part of it do both of you think can be improved?
I'll take a shot at that, Felicia. And my response is not just restricted to Duke University, but to any academic institution, and beyond that, any educational institution, starting with preschool. I'm of the opinion that one of the challenges has to do with tensions between the ethos of the United States of America, at our best, who we imagine ourselves to be, right? And so you hear these notions of the land of opportunity and manifest dreams and egalitarian meritocracy. The ideology, the specific social, political, and socioeconomic systems that get constructed that either deliver upon the promise of the ethos or fail to do that. Belief that our ideology delivers upon this for everyone. And then finally, the evidence, both historical and contemporary, which does not support the notion of this thing ever being egalitarian or meritocratic, right? Slavery, forced relocation, and genocide are not egalitarian and meritocratic. And so I get to my point. I believe that the way our historical curricula are constructed should be fundamentally revised to tell a simple, small t, social scientific truth as pertains to the history of the United States of America. And if we get that right, I believe that we can have a generation or several generations of young folks who are in a better position, right, to recognize and receive contemporary differences in life chances, that is, opportunity structures, the distribution of resources and risk, resources that enhance, risks that constrain, and how reliably they translate into the outcomes that the ethos promise, or that the ethos promises they should. And I'll stop there. Thank you for the question.
Thank you again. I really hope nothing that I said at least should not be understood that there is a simple map and then marching orders, it will get us there. I repeat, the challenge is way too complicated, and it requires nothing but really multi-generational educational approach. But there are things that we can do better here at Duke University. Let me give a few examples. We are in the middle of Black History Month. We can do this better because we have been doing these Februaries for quite some time and things are not getting any better. We need some critical look into why is this month-long celebrations are not giving the empowerment, motivation, and commitment that we need to solve some of these problems. I find, with all due respect to good things, there is a room for improvement. Second, it's very, very difficult to move the progress towards really having difficult conversations about our past. Can you imagine today anybody not liking MLK, Dr. King, that prophet from our previous century? Can you imagine if anybody wants to give him a grade, as my friend Adam Hollowell says, giving him like F or C minus, D? Now you can imagine. But on the day he was assassinated, he was a lot less popular than Donald Trump today. Not to be political here. Here's a former president going through the least popular time of his time, but even in his lowest moment, Donald Trump, the former president, is a lot more popular than MLK was on the day he was assassinated. Now we sort of sterilized his legacy and turned him into a saint and love him. It's all fine. But unless we bring ourselves and say in 1965, 66, 60s, what made him so unpopular? What prophetic discomfort that he was pumping? That's what we're talking about, because the same problem, that's what we say structural and systemic, that we have to bring ourselves to have those difficult conversations. Dealing structural inequality and systemic racism is not about having good conversation, diverse people with all the representation and having these ceremonies. Unfortunately, here at Duke, many of what we do doesn't go beyond these kind of gracious goodwill act, which in itself is important. I'm not trivializing these efforts. It's important. But if you start there and end there, and if this goodwill is not turning into a rage and motivation and commitment and doesn't make you think, again, we fall incredibly short. I can give several more examples, but let's not look, okay, tell me what to do. This is so easy. First, I think of the presentation, what hit me the most, Jay, is when you talk about stolen narratives. That's the biggest theft. That's the biggest destruction. So destruction that represents the destruction within people's soft power. Are we telling them those narratives correctly today? Are we able to have conversations about slavery and its bloody consequences as it manifests itself within the halls of power? I think we can do better. Again, big picture is difficult. We should inspire our students to go become legislators and maybe change also the bigger. But here, even at Duke, can we have conversations at least in February to bring ourselves to that level of honesty and self-interrogating posture where we can have these difficult conversations is our challenge. What's stopping us? Jay and I are Stanford. We should be able to do this within our own limits. And what's getting in the way, especially now that the climate is giving us the moral authority? What's stopping graduate school to have some honest educational opportunities about how those narratives were stolen from people, so that especially international students will not come and blame the victim for their failure?
Thank you both. I think that actually answers a little bit of some of the questions that came up on the chat. So I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, but Dr. Ain Mitchell Wishning asked, whether do any of you have any specific policies or practices here that you think you should pay attention to? And I think this is somewhat very similar with Dr. Frankie Dennis Powell, who asked whether you have any recommendations for future engagement. And I see her also raising her hand, so perhaps she would like to add a little bit onto that as well.
Yeah, good evening. And this has been a great presentation. I did want to ask you a little more about strategic, I said engagement with quotations. I believe that might have been what you said, Abdullah. But and I quoted 2019 quote from one of my pastors, who said that a vision without a strategic plan is a hallucination. And I was asking what precisely will help us not hallucinate. So the emphasis, I mean, in the meantime, you know, both you and Jay talked a little bit more about, I heard some things, like I heard you say, Abdullah, a better, more empowering Black History Month at Duke. And I thought I heard Jay say a much more truthful social science, social history. I know where I live in Forsyth County, they're struggling with the school board for a better, or across the state for a better history to be taught. But the emphasis that I'm making is strategically. If we've got, as a former of Return to Private Life professor, I know that if I'm there in a university, we have tenure and we may have certain assignments. Administration may talk about, what do y'all call it? Community service, right, Ariel? That you have so many hours to do that at undergrad, but maybe either in the institutional environment or in the community environment, strategically, what can we do to kind of embed the responses so the next person will be able to carry it forward and do something with it? That's kind of where I'm going. Does that make sense? Okay. You want to try to answer it, either one of you? Hey, you gave me a thumbs up, but then you want to leave it alone.
Yeah, so no, you ask a critically important question. And to Abdullah's point, I was founding co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee over in Sanford, or at least the latest manifestation of it, because as it turns out, there have been several different versions of it. And I'm going to be brutally honest here, and this has to do with, you know, some of what I said about the events of last summer and, you know, again, the latest manifestation of the move towards racial justice here, which, you know, by my count is over 400 years old now, is that, and Abdullah touched on this, I am tired of reactive responses to what I'm now referring to as dehumanizing humanization. And by that, I mean, it takes these absolutely ridiculous, high-profile murders in the street being captured on cell phones for the narratives of people of color writ large, but particularly those of Black Americans, to be deemed worthy of a humanizing response, right? And so, you know, one of the challenges, and something I've thought about a lot, and I have a meeting with the dean in our school next week, and this is going to be the central topic of discussion, is why are we always reactive instead of being proactive and understanding the value of recognizing and affirming human dignity for all of our citizens at Duke University, right? There's been a rush to put together programs, and people will say, this is not who we are. Well, yeah, it is, because it keeps happening. And part of the reason that it keeps happening at Duke is because we haven't taken seriously the business of creating a curricula that teaches every Duke family member, staff, students, faculty, and administrators, our specific history from the broad range of perspectives, that is, the perspective of supremacy, privilege, oppression, and discrimination, in that order. Or to put it another way, I'm not sure that I personally need, require, or want another majority population person proposing to teach me new and more effective ways to contend with dehumanizing oppression. What I would like is for some of these folks to recognize the nature of supremacy, that this system was designed by a narrowly defined group of people to benefit that group of people, and the sets of privileges that are conferred to those folks, and how to dismantle that. And let's create a more inclusive process of institutional construction and development. But that's just me.
That's just not you, my friend. And what I was trying to say also, thank you so much, Dr. Powell. I think the bulk of our responsibility is pre-policy. I am hesitant to even go there because we are talking about behavioral change, individually and collectively as the Duke community. But what behavioral change, why are we educating people to put good ideas? Because we believe behavioral change is only possible if you replace bad ideas with the good ideas. What we do individually and collectively are a manifestation of the ideas that we have about this issue. I think Jay said it in many different beautiful ways. The ideas that we have about race, equality, equity is not right yet. That's why the policies are limping. That's why the result is just reactive. That's why I'm inviting us to go back to the fundamental ideas about who we are and who we want to be and examine those ideas. If that happens, the policies that comes as a result will be, you will see, much more sharp, much more effective, much less liability oriented, much more solution oriented. And I can say more, but I see my good friend Ajinai, who's already here, and put a question. She has been working on this both in Europe and the United States for a very long time. I want to just welcome him. It was his birthday a couple of days ago. I want to say happy birthday and give her an opportunity to voice her question and share some of her experience. Now, I don't mean to put you on the spot, Ajinai, but do you mind?
Oh, not at all. Thank you so much, Professor Antepli and Professor Pearson. This has been so wonderful and educational. And my question was, I've noticed that a lot of times decision makers will strongly encourage, sometimes require minority groups to coalesce around a sort of set of priorities, recommendations, or like individuals to communicate with. And obviously there are some efficiencies to that, and it's also can be beneficial for the minority groups themselves to have some level of organization. But beyond that, it can certainly be to their detriment to do that. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that balance of that in allowing minorities to not be flattened through these kinds of processes.
Yeah, I can speak to that first. And again, Dr. Antepli just addressed this, but thank you, Ajinai, for that important work that you're doing to address some of these issues. This is something that I've thought about a great deal. And what my first point to say is, I make a distinction between race, ethnicity, and national origin, right? So there's heterogeneity within these groups that we frequently assume are homogeneous. And I believe that heterogeneity is our most precious resource, right? That range of social cultural orientations, viewpoints, and perspectives that we can bring to bear to try to reconcile some of these tensions across these groups is absolutely, positively, critically important. And to that end, I suspect, and I can't confirm this because there's not a lot of good empirically based work on this, but if we can create opportunities to have meaningful social interactions with folks who we imagine are differently from us in important ways, and find that they might not be as different at the core as we imagine. And then in some of the spaces where we don't understand where groups of people are different, have an opportunity to engage and parse some of that stuff out. And again, humanize these folks who might look the same, but have very different underlying experiences. And then understand, again, how that range of perspectives might provide resources for all of us to do this better collectively, right? And so there's a small body of literature on something called social contact theory from social psych that does some of that, but most of that is in small university settings. And I have a sneaky suspicion that there are folks in many places in the United States of America who don't get access to the kind of opportunity, the precious resource that we're having here right now.
Beautifully said. If I may quickly add, regretfully, a lot of the flattening of the minorities, regretfully, and I hope it will come out respectfully, is being done with good intentions.
Right.
And I'm sick and tired of good intentions. And no wonder the path to hell is paved by good intentions. And we need to analyze and critically challenge these good intentions. And for example, some of that flattening is because the superficial way of engaging with critical race theory. Some of that flattening is because, and I'm really angry, the way the diversity and inclusion is done on this campus. Very superficial, shallow, labelist, as if you have one minority face, as if that responsibility is done and you have to move on, etc. Like the problem is, we're not talking about far right, far left. We are talking about, I am so moved, like every couple of weeks or months, I read this letter from the Birmingham jail. The guy is not talking about the racists and KKK, it's talking us, people like at Duke, liberals, progressives, these so-called lefty, minority-loving people. The issue is with us, the solution is with us. Look, there are things the law enforcement needs to do with these crazy racist people. But the solution, a lot of this flattening is done through our inability to internalize and do the good work and the substantial work without moving into or slipping into cheesy, ceremonial, achy stuff.
Thank you so much for that. And unfortunately, I have to cut it really short because we are moving to breakout rooms. So hopefully we can bring in all of those questions to our breakout rooms and we will have like a much deeper discussion as well. So Dean Allen, perhaps you can start.
So our student leaders, thank you, Felicia, are assigned to the breakout rooms. You all have been assigned to the breakout rooms and we will reconvene. I'll reconvene us in about 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you. So thank you so much to all of our participants. Just for the sake of time, is there one particular student group leader that would like to just give a synopsis of what your group spoke about? Blair, yes, thank you.
I'd love to share what my group was talking about. We really engaged with sort of the history of Duke and how that's being shared and the role that historians play in doing that. And also how once we like arrive on campus, like how is history shared and what are people's relationships to that history? Like how do people engage with it? Whether you're from Durham and you're learning about what Duke means or what the role Duke has played in Durham and just sort of like the narrative surrounding that. And how can we do better to share that history when people come to campus? Because I think that could really help our understanding of Duke's role in positive and many negative ways and how we can then move forward and grow from that.
Claire, thank you so much for that. I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, Dean Cisco Ramos.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I want to thank everyone for attending tonight's Race and Bias Conversations event. I don't know about you, but I could certainly stay here for a lot longer. But again, thank you. And again, a special thank you to the Women in Science and Engineering, Drs. Pearson and Tepley for their time, insight, wise words, and leadership. There are two final events in the Race and Bias Conversation series. So on Tuesday, March 9th, from 3 to 4 p.m., we'll be joined by distinguished graduate school alumni, Dr. Elizabeth Horge Freeman, who is presently the Senior Advisor to the President and Provost for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of South Florida, and Dr. George Wright, Presidential Senior Advisor and Interim Vice President for Institutional Diversity at the University of Kentucky, where they will discuss their institution's efforts in addressing racism, bias, and inclusion. And the final event for this year will take place on Wednesday, March 24th from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m., where we'll be joined by Professor Sandy Darity, who will lead a discussion on position, power, and property, racial economic inequality in the United States. So please mark your calendars. Thank you once again for attending tonight's discussion. Have a good night.